very much. Phew, that's a really, really nice turnout today. Thank you, Kailash Satyarthi. It was truly inspirational to hear you here today. And it's this kind of compassion, commitment, and courage that in times of despair, the world is lifted by a sense of hope and optimism. You have not just restored innocence, but you have also given future a chance for our children. From a conversation that tugs at our conscience to one that now goes into the world of hard power, it's a bit of a leap, but I hope you will bear with me. But thank you for being here today. To Nayantra Bali, convener, to my good friend Sanjeev Iyer, many illustrious alumni here, Piyush, Mr. Girja Pandey, I can see others here too, to my former senior colleague and former Deputy National Security Advisor of India, Ms. Latha Reddy, and to all the friends over here. I'm really here not so much as the High Commissioner of India to Singapore, as much as an alumnus of IIM. I can tell you that I didn't do much by way of class participation when I was at the Institute, and that was because I felt that I had either nothing to say or whatever I had to say was known to everyone, and this is exactly how I feel here today, because geopolitics is something that touches everyone's life. There's everyone who has a point of view on it, and an equally valid one at that. And if you look at WhatsApp groups, there are very intense discussions on geopolitics and some very insightful ones. So now, for those who live on the WhatsApp, to those who are in the world of actual diplomacy, there has never been a more interesting time in the world of geopolitics. Almost everything that we were familiar with, almost every assumptions that we had have been turned on its head. Friends have become foes, foes have become friends, alliances have withered, new tactics, new strategies have come into existence. Geopolitics is undergoing a profound change. But instead of looking at it in pieces, let me just step back a little bit and try to assume a little bit of a sort of intellectual weight in this, and go back to a few centuries at the start of the first industrial revolution. And we've known that from then on that technology has always had a profound impact on political, economic, and military power, and therefore on the power of values as well. So the first industrial revolution led to Britain pulling away from the others. The second industrial revolution saw also the rise of France and Germany and Russia, and further afield, the beginning of the rise of Japan in the United States. But the first two industrial revolutions created a wave of globalization that lasted until about the first decade of the 20th century, which led to the concentration of power in the hands of the West, because it became easy and cheap to move goods and raw material, but not yet ideas, people, and finances. And it was in the third industrial revolution that in some ways is linked to technology of telecommunication, electronics, and computing, that we began to see an even greater concentration of power in the hands of the West and the rise of the United States as the preeminent power in the world. But this was also the time that because new technology enabled movement not just of goods and resources, but also of people, ideas, and finances, that you began to see the green shoots of industrialization in many other countries in Asia, about which we shall speak. But industrial technology has also had a profound impact for military. The first industrial revolution enabled us to see the mass mobilization of military a la Napoleon. And the second industrial revolution led to mechanization of warfare, and which continued with us until about the 20th century. And the third industrial revolution, once again, with linked to information-centric warfare, satellites, stealth, C4, and other technology-related defense, led once again to an even bigger rise of United States and the rest of the West as the preeminent global military power. But what we are also witnessing now, as I said, that is also this growth of the digital technology. What I would say towards the end of the third industrial revolution and at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, we're also beginning to see that there has been a diffusion of industrial power. It is also ridden on a unique phenomenon in recent history, which is that we had a globally integrated trade regime and we had a relatively stable international order. And those countries that invested in policies, in infrastructure, and human resources were able to take advantage of this ability of technology to seamlessly move ideas, technology, people, finance, and goods to create now a new industrial power. And what that has led to is, of course, what we see today, a diffusion of economic power and shift, as we see in the economic balance towards the East. We've, of course, seen the rise of Japan and then China, Asian tigers, and now it's India's turn to sustain the Asian prosperity. But this is the first time in 300 years, in 3 centuries, that the world's largest economy will not be an English-speaking, Western, democratic, liberal, market-driven economy. And that means something for the rest of the world. As you look into the future and you look at the kind of countries that will be in the top 10 in terms of the aggregate of economic power, it'll be spread across the world, from Latin America to Asia, and also to Europe and the North America. But the difference will be that the largest economies will not necessarily be the richest, and the richest economies will not necessarily be the largest. And that hobbles the ability of what would be some of the largest economies to be able to project power that you might associate with that aggregate. There is also, concomitant with the rise of industrial and economic power in certain parts of the world, a diffusion of military power. We're seeing an unprecedented increase in military spending, also some sort of a nuclear renaissance taking place in the world. But just as the first wave of globalization was the age of divergence, the second wave of globalization, which lasted till about 2008, at least in its present form, was an age of convergence. We saw a relative decline or reduction in the gap between the West and the East. And this relative decline in the West is reflected in the popular discontent that you see in many countries in the West. But it has also led to something else. It has eroded the inspirational, incentivizing, and coercive power of the West. It's the Western liberal order, which the West had created as a result of the accumulation of military, economic, and technological power, and the institutions that they had built around it are themselves under siege in many of these countries. It is no longer attractive to those countries that actually built it, and you can see that in almost every pronouncement of President Trump. And he doesn't just reflect his own views, it's views that are reflected from many, 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 many centers of power. So it is also the fact that you see that the whole Western liberal order is under siege within those countries. You see the reduction in the incentivizing, coercive, or inspiring power of the West, and you see that those countries that actually built that international order are, in a sense, don't find it useful and are quite prepared to dismantle it. We are also seeing, therefore, the erosion of those institutions of governance, the United Nations system, of trade, WTO, of development, World Bank and the IMF, and of security, the non-proliferation regime. We're also seeing change in the character as a result of this technology, in the character of democratic societies, the ability for anyone to address an entire population unfiltered by the media, and by the ability of other countries to have a say in the internal process of other countries, again through the use of cyber media, is changing the character of democracy also. It is also leading to what we are witnessing, the rise of conservatism and identity politics. For a long time, including in the developing world, we lived with the idea of nation state, the Westphalian state system, the immutability of boundaries, and the fact, including in developing countries, that nations were built on values and not on identities, and that the state structure that supports the nation must be neutral to these impulses, was deeply ingrained in the way many of the developing countries that came out of colonial experience developed their initial aspiration. But all of that is under challenge too. So where are we today? One, of course, is that we are, as I was just saying, witnessing a great transition taking place in the economic power in the world. And as a result of this change in the economic power in the world, new countries that are now gaining power want to rewrite those rules. We are witnessing, as I said again, a change in the military balance of power also taking place in the world. But this is perhaps somewhat less evident than the diffusion of economic power. And for example, in the case of the United States, which is certainly a much stronger military power in relative terms today than it is in terms of its economic power. And its desire to retain and sustain that primacy is also causing a little bit of that kind of tension that is taking place in the world. I mean, and this is a natural a process that is taking place. But linked to this also is the fact that we are, for the most important change that is taking place at this point of time, of course, is the rise of China. For a long time, China also harnessed this technological change that is taking place in the world in order to reclaim its own historical role in the world. And for the West, there was this assumption that the lure of the market, the impact of integration, the constraints of the international order, and the deterrence of military power will lead to China being assimilated into a Western liberal order. But as we know, that wasn't going to be the case, and in 2008 was a point of inflection. And where are we, therefore, now today? US primacy is under challenge. China would like to rewrite the global order, at least those pieces that are in a sense seen as an obstacle to its own rise. United States will not abandon its policy since World War II of preventing the rise of another peer competitor. China, on the other hand, will not accept the conditions of the United States that will impose constraints on its own growth, and therefore, we are in this fundamental position of a decoupling that is quite likely to grow despite all tactical changes. China's rise is awe-inspiring, of course, but it has its own limitations. It's its demography, its debt, its restructuring. It is also the deepening state control and the rise of power elite. For the first time, China is also attempting, something which has never done in its history, which is consolidation of the continental landmass simultaneously with control of the contested seas through the Belt and Road Initiative, and we do not know how far that is going to succeed despite all the hype around it. It also has external challenges in terms of number of friends it has, in terms of number of allies it can generate. its soft power, the trust and confidence that it can generate. United States will also be reassessing its own terms of international engagement, and it will no longer be willing or able to assume the role of providing public good, of maintaining and underpinning the international order, nor is there any evidence to suggest that China will try to assume that mantle in its ability, for example, to write the international regulations, set up international institutions, settle international disputes, enforce peace, or even convene a coalition. We do not know whether that's going to happen, whether it is even willing or wanting to do that. The fact of the matter is that we are concentrating a lot on whether 5G, artificial intelligence, machine learning, Internet of Things will eventually lead to which of these two countries becoming stronger or more powerful. That, the jury is still out. But from the geopolitical point of view, that really matters to an extent only. But what we have to see is that what is the shape of the world going to be as we go ahead? I mean, and there are four fundamental propositions. One is, will it be a G1 dominated by one country? That seems unlikely. Will it be a G2, a compact of the United States and China? That also seems unlikely. Will it be a concert of nations acting as good adults and building consensus around maintaining a common international order? That also seems unlikely. So we will probably end up with the fourth, which is a number of major and leading powers, and I use the two words differently, major and leading powers, all jostling for and competing for influence and power in a world. We have seen, for example, of course, the rise of United States and China and Russia will be there. There'll be India. Indonesia will be there. There's Japan and Korea that will continue. Brazil, Mexico, perhaps even Argentina if it gets its act together. In the Middle East, it's going to be Turkey, Iran, Saudi-led, and Israel. These are countries that will be able to compete and exercise influences in their own spheres. We will see the rise of civilizational states as opposed to nation states. We will see that democracy will no longer be seen as the dominant idea or correlated with prosperity and progress, that it is not necessarily the only vehicle to sustain prosperity and progress. And therefore, you will see the coexistence of many systems, many cultures, many political organizations. The rules-based international order as we see it will not exist. Now, there's no speech today by any leader in the world that doesn't speak about the rules-based international order. We're all familiar with it. Nothing tells you more about the uncertainty about the rules-based international order as we exist by the fact that it gets repeated in almost every speech. You never heard this about 10, 15 years ago. And the big question is, will there be no rules-based order? Will there be a new one? If there is a new one, how are you going to write it? Because if there is no dominant power or a set of powers, who will do it? Can the world come together to write it together? Will it be through a war and the dominant power writes the morality for the loser? Or it will simply, so this is again a question that we do not know as yet. But we do know that the global institutions will no longer be effective, and the new institutions that will come up will not be global. We've also seen that the world is moving more towards smaller groups, but also we see that G7 has almost entirely been replaced by G20, and which reflects how there is a greater diffusion of power taking place in the world. Trade, as we know, WTO is under siege. It is almost slowly becoming less and less relevant as an organizing principle of global trade. FTAs are coming into vogue, but while it is fashionable today to speak about FTAs, its larger purpose and its larger good is yet uncertain, and especially as it leads to fragmentation of global trade. Technology denial is going to continue. I mean, technology is something that has been at the heart of global power competition. And we are just beginning to see that the regime of technology denial, technology restraints is going to spread. And that may lead to something that we had never assumed or imagined that would happen in the internet age, the possibility of decoupling once again of what seemed like a seamlessly connected world linked by technology. And for all of us who have dealt with technology denial regimes in the context of the West or any other country, we know how difficult it can be. And it also leads us to the next issue, which is the future of data. And the issue of data sovereignty is growing in strength, and what seemed almost a given that data could flow seamlessly across the world may eventually enter in a world where data would also be traded, or at least there will be checkposts and gate points all along, and countries would demand how their data is treated. There will be, of course, another amp. Not only will globalization is under stress, but globalism. Globalization and globalism both are under stress. So the ability of the world to come together to do what people like Kailash Satyarthi would want us to do, that is to come together to solve our common problems, from climate change to gender issues to child trafficking to all, would be far, far more difficult in an age where consensus may elude us. Military competition is obviously going to get more informationized, as people say. It'll also migrate into cyber, which is far more dangerous because the source of an attack is always going to be hard to predict. And if conventional military response is going to be an answer to a debilitating, crippling cyber attack, without having the certainty of whether the attack originated, we could be staring at a somewhat difficult future. And I'm confident that the world will try to come around it, but not certain whether we will succeed in doing it as we did for the nuclear or chemical, biological weapons. Maritime is once again back in fashion. So not since the colonial era when the control of seas was a very important geopolitical reality, we are beginning to see maritime as once again, in the cyber age, as a key factor of global competition and power. Alliances are going to be very fluid and certain. They will not be like the alliances of the 20th century. They will be more fluid, more issue-based. And finally, we're beginning to see new political geographies being constructed. During the era of colonial times, we saw the world being divided into, or Asia, for example, being divided into South Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia, and so on and so forth. In the times of Cold War, we saw the emergence of concepts of Asia-Pacific. And today we are seeing new geographies. We're seeing the rise of Indo-Pacific. And that rise of Indo-Pacific is largely a reflection not just of the interconnected security and economic imperatives that range from African shores to the American shores, but also by the rise of India that is going to change the balance in this region. We see the emergence of the northern tier in Middle East and the southern tier. The northern tier defined, for example, by Turkey, Iran, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, gravitating more towards the Eurasian landmass. And we see a southern tier centered around the Gulf countries, which will be more maritime, and perhaps more closely linked to perhaps the United States and China and India. We see the new fault lines emerging in Eurasia as the integration of the Eurasian landmass, or at least the Eastern Eurasian landmass, within the framework of SCO, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is reflecting. In Africa, we might see the return of the 19th century, where local competition will be overlaid by geopolitical competition for resources and influence. It's already beginning to happen, and you see United States, India, China, Europe, Turkey, UAE, all of them now competing for space in there. So when you look at a future like this, it sounds pessimistic, and it might well be, or it might be better, but it reflects more the general trend of the world that has been there before these last 300 years began to change the complexion of the world. And if you think of where we were in 17th century, we were again, a large number of powers operating in relatively autonomous zones, but also engaging and interacting with each other. And that might ironically be also a future for an increasingly interconnected world. But this is going to be just a difficult also period for small and large countries alike, but perhaps more for smaller countries that have profited most from a rules-based international order in which there's predictability and stability and certain norms that drive behavior for all countries. For India too, this is a moment when our own rise is taking place in a changing world, in which we will have to work to manage our relationship both in our neighborhood and in great power relationship in a way that maximizes our strategic space and creates enough opportunities for India's continued growth and rise. But let me conclude by saying that this is no law of physics, this is no universal law. All of this might be true and all of this might be wrong, but this is the way, at least I see the world emerging in the course of this century. Thank you very much.